No one knew where the storm had come from, but it was the worst any of us had ever seen. The floor tilted sickeningly each time we drifted up or crashed down one of the massive North Atlantic waves. They were high enough to break across the 30-meter-tall bow of our cargo ship, and at night, the waves always seem even bigger. Beyond the glow of the ship lights, the dark distances are infinite. The rolling, black walls of water reach for the even blacker sky, scraping across it like the clawing hands of drowned giants. There's no help in a place like that. No rescue team that could arrive in time. No emergency number to call. No Christ to calm the waters. Just a few desperate primates clinging to a hunk of metal, caught in the path of nature's wrath. It was no wonder I couldn't sleep. If I had been able to catch some shut-eye in the heaving, creaking guts of the ship, I might not have seen the man in the water, and everything would be different. He was drifting toward us, just an orange dot on the crest of a massive wave. Only the flashing red light on his life jacket allowed me to track his position as he drew closer. We were his only chance. We all knew it. But my crewmates weren't born yesterday. In every one of our grim, tense faces, I could see the same reluctance, the same cold calculation. We all knew the dangers of going out there, and no one wanted to be the first to volunteer. Maybe it was because I'd seen him first, or maybe I just knew that, since I was one of the only crew members already in a dry suit, it had to be me. Whatever the reason, I headed for the door. Andre, a glum Russian who smoked more than he talked, nodded to me. He was coming too. I felt a surge of gratitude toward this man I hardly knew, now risking his life so that I wouldn't have to go alone. A whitecap sloshed water through the door the moment we opened it. The wind howled like a living thing, and it was a struggle just to clip into our harnesses. The cables that bound us to the ship were capable of withstanding hundreds of pounds of force, but that night, they felt as flimsy as butcher's twine. In the face of such awesome power, all we could do was hurl a life preserver toward the tiny, doomed figure in the orange life jacket and hope he'd be able to grab it in time. The ship was closing on him fast, and there would be no second chance. I hesitated. If I threw and missed, the man's death would be on my hands. I felt Andre tug the life preserver from my hands, and it made a strange arc as it flew through the stormy skies. Somehow, it landed in the path of the man in the orange life jacket. By swimming with the storm, he was able to reach the life preserver, but only just. As Andre and I hauled him in, I found myself glancing at the ever larger waves on the horizon and wondered if we were all going to drown in these frigid seas soon enough. We didn't even look at the man we'd fished out of the storm until we were back behind the ship's groaning metal walls. Whoever he was, his dry suit looked eerily familiar. With its red color and silver reflective triangles, it could have come from our own supply. Seawater dripped from the hair hanging over the man's face. I was working to free him from his life jacket when I noticed the logo on the orange material. It was the name of our ship. In fact, all of his gear was from our ship. Andre must have realized the same thing at the same time, because for a moment, there was no sound apart from the roar of the storm. We were paralyzed by the impossibility of it. Davis read the name on his gear, a name I'd never heard. We were a small crew, and I knew every...
"You have to turn this ship around,"
Davis rasped through chattering teeth. There was terror in his sunken eyes, but it was more than fear of the storm.
"You don't recognize me, do you?"
He asked me accusingly.
"Andre, what about you? Please say you know me."
I had never seen the man before in my life, but somehow he knew who we were.
"What the hell is this?"
Andre grunted, picked the stranger up by his collar, and slammed him into the wall.
"Where did you come from, eh? How do you have our gear? Turn the ship around!"
The man shrieked. Droplets of chill water flew from his ragged hair as he screamed. We lurched over yet another huge wave. Everything that wasn't tied down slid wildly to the left. We all lost our footing. Davis freed himself from Andre's grip and took off running toward the bridge. I don't know how he knew his way through those twisting, badly painted hallways. I don't know how he was even able to move after being buffeted by the icy waves. But I did know that if this madman attempted to turn this ship around, we were all dead men. The moment one of those waves hit us broadside, it would flip the cargo ship like a toy. Then it would be the nightmare that I'd had since I'd taken this job, one that maybe all sailors have. The sickening pitch, the sudden rush of heart-stopping ice-cold water, the limbs that tire, the lungs that drown, the blackness that swallows everything. I could almost feel it nipping at my heels as I skidded on the slick floor and grasped for the stranger's life jacket. On the bridge, I could hear my crewmates whispering about our chances in frightened tones. Their conversations stopped dead when the stranger careened into the room.
Don't you know me?
He panted. I could see the desperation in his eyes as they darted from one confused face to another.
Don't any of you know me? Grab him!
Andre was yelling.
He's crazy.
We pitched down another wave, and suddenly, everyone was too busy hanging on to worry about the stranger. A coffee cup fell to the floor and shattered. Davis grabbed a sharp ceramic shard and ran toward the one person who hadn't said a word, hadn't panicked, but instead had kept her full focus on guiding us through the storm. Captain Erica Mitchell. I'd served on this ship before Captain Mitchell joined, and I had to admit, I didn't think much of the idea of having a woman for captain at first. Ours was rough, hard, solitary work, and I wasn't alone in seeing it as a man's work. But after 7 years of serving under her, there was no one's hand I would have preferred at the helm. If there was anyone who could get us through this, it was her. And now her life was in danger. My fellow crewmen leapt to their feet, but it was too late. Davis had grabbed Captain Mitchell and was holding the ceramic shard so tightly against her neck that a trickle of blood flowed down her collar.
Don't any of you move!
The stranger muttered.
Don't any of you dare move!
Captain Mitchell kept her hands up, calm as always. The bigger problem, I saw, was that with Mitchell incapacitated and the stranger refusing to allow anyone near the helm, steering would be impossible. More mountain-like waves rose ahead of us. They were endless and as awesome as they were terrifying. Gale-force winds whipped the spray from the whitecaps, and for a moment, there was silence.
Let's all just take it easy.
Captain Mitchell kept her voice under control.
Let's start with you. Who are you, friend? What do you want? Look.
Davis licked his lips.
See that clock on the wall? It reads 2:56. At 3:03, we're going to see something out there. Something even bigger than those waves. Something that wants to keep us trapped in our final moments, devouring our fear and anguish in a loop forever.
I think we were all staring at him with the same dumbfounded face, but a few of us were moving, creeping closer to the stranger, hoping he wouldn't notice until we were near enough to pounce.
Turning around in this storm will kill us all. You know it, I know it. But trust me, that's better than what's up ahead.
Lightning flashed. We could see nothing on the horizon but more of the endless storm.
Just think about it,
the man rambled.
What can you remember before the storm? Before tonight? Now!
The chief mate, who'd been a linebacker in college, tackled Davis. Captain Mitchell jabbed her elbow into his ribs, and he dropped his ceramic shard with a gasp.
No!
The stranger screamed.
You have to believe me. We're heading for a fate worse than death.
The clock read 2:58. Captain Mitchell pressed a napkin to her bleeding neck. Chief Mate Anderson had taken over the helm. The stranger continued to flail around, screaming incomprehensibly about fear drinkers and loops and monsters outside time. Keeping him restrained was no easy task, especially with the way the ship was rocking. But for some reason, Andre was holding me back.
Take him below,
Captain Mitchell murmured. Why was everyone staring at me?
Let's go.
Andre sighed, his hand on my shoulder.
What? What's going on?
I muttered, shaking off his hand. It was only by chance that I glanced through the bathroom door, hurled open by the rocking of the ship, and saw my face in the mirror above the sink. My face. Davis's face. I looked at the name tags on my dry suit, my life jacket. It all read Davis. What the hell was going on?
Easy,
Andre warned. But I had to know. I still had my harness from when we'd rescued the stranger from the sea. That man who was me. I still had on my dry suit, my life jacket. If I moved fast, I waited for another wave to rock the ship before I sprinted for the door that led to the bow. Andre gave chase. His big, strong hands grabbed my life jacket while I was still fighting to get the door open. But the surge of water that rushed inside when it opened allowed me to slip free. I clipped on and clung to the railing, the gale force winds buffeting me like a rag doll as I slogged toward the bow. I had to see what lay ahead. My watch read 3:01. Andre yelled something incomprehensible behind me. The ship's sirens blared. Freezing waves knocked my feet from under me like a horrible prelude, a nightmarish teaser for the rolling black water below. When it became too difficult to stand, I crawled. Only the frail tether of my harness held me to the ship. It might snap at any moment. Then I saw it. An enormous, indescribable shape, darker than the night sky. In its impossible limbs, our ship would be no larger than a child's toy. I wasn't sure if it had eyes, but I could feel it looking at us just the same. We were heading straight for it. As we crested another wave, I could see the thousands of cockroach-like limbs that lined its chest rustle together with anticipation. Its slimy black tendrils, each as wide as a city bus, lashed against the stormy sky. 3:03. Even at this distance, the thing on the horizon had already begun to drink my mind. The process was pure agony. Memories, dreams, hopes, nightmares. I could feel each one fading as it was sucked out of me. But there was no way to fight it, no way to hold on. Except, I looked down into the frothing black water below. If I could escape the loop, if I could go back, if I could warn us. Hanging onto the railing by the crook of my elbow, I fought the salt spray to prepare my dry suit for immersion. I turned on the flashing red light on my life jacket. My eyes paused when they passed over my name. Yes, Davis, that was it. Stitched on the life jacket, onto the dry suit. I saw the logo of our ship. This time, they'd believe me. They had to. I'd find a way. If not, we'd be trapped in this nightmarish storm forever. With one last look at the writhing monstrosity on the horizon, I took a deep breath, unclipped my harness, and threw myself into the sea.
You ever been on a boat before, Lucas?
Asked the burly man on the pier.
Dangerous work. A man's liable to go over the side if he ain't careful.
I ran my hands through my mop of auburn hair. I had sent in an application months before and told the captain I had no experience on the water, but maybe he didn't see that part. It had worried me at that moment that I may be about to lose the job before I even started. "No, sir," I replied. "I have no experience on a boat. I know how to swim and have spent time at the lakes back home, but nothing like this." Captain Orange furrowed his brow as he looked me over. It was hard to determine his age. All of his hair had gone gray, and his face was lined with deep wrinkles. His body was a stout rack of muscle. He was either in his later years, or life on the sea had worn him down.
My business manager must not have looked over your application too well, he said dismissively. Crabbing on the Bering Sea ain't a game. You young folks watch some damn show on the Discovery Channel and think it's a quick payday. It ain't. Not sure this is gonna be for you.
I grabbed my duffel bag from the wet concrete and turned to walk back to the hotel. My mind raced between the disappointment of rejection and the panic of having to pay for a plane ticket home. My bank account was nearly drained, and I would have to use my already maxed out credit card.
Hang on, he shouted. Be here at 6 in the morning tomorrow. It's too damn late for me to find a new deckhand, and you're just gonna have to learn to be useful real quick. If you can't keep up, crab ain't gonna be the only thing we dump at the port.
The old man turned and walked back onto the deck of his boat before vanishing into the wheelhouse. FV Weeping Widow rocked gently against the pier. I spent the first 2 hours of our trip to the Bering Sea violently dumping my breakfast into the filthy toilet just off the kitchen. Every time I retched, I could hear the other deckhands howl with laughter outside. Captain Orange had told the crew to hit their bunks for a bit of rest before we reached the crabbing grounds. But their laughter and jeers made it clear they had no intention of heeding the advice. It seemed like all of my stomach contents had successfully ejected when pounding began to sound against the thin wooden door.
"All right, Greenhorn,"
one of the deckhands shouted.
"Time to get off your ass and on your feet. We'll be dropping pot soon, and that herring won't hop in the bait bag. Let's move!"
I could hear the sounds of their voices growing quiet and the thuds of heavy boots heading up the steps onto the deck. Wiping my face on my sleeve, I pushed myself onto my feet and walked out the door. The smell of beer and cigarette smoke nearly made my seasick stomach turn again, but I managed to press the urge back down. Pushing the bulkhead door open, I entered the equipment room where the other hands were slipping into their cold weather gear and waders. A big man who I thought was named Jimmy shoved a bright orange bodysuit into my hands and smacked me on the shoulder. I looked at it in confusion. It was completely different from the gear the other men were wearing.
What's this?
I asked the man.
It doesn't look like the same gear the rest of you have.
"That's an immersion suit, son,"
he responded with mild annoyance.
"Captain told us you've never been out to sea before and got no boat experience. Me and all the boys think you'll fall overboard, and this is the only thing likely to save your rookie ass."
The other man began to howl with laughter again. I began to put on the enormous suit, unsure if it was a joke or not. There was no other gear in the room, so my options were limited. The others began to file out of the bulkhead and onto the deck. After 5 minutes of struggling into the immersion gear, I was finally ready to join them outside. Cutting wind and water slapped my face as soon as I stepped onto the deck. The other hands scurried from crab pots, cinching ropes, and checking for holes. Jimmy stood beside an industrial grinder and waved me over.
"Grab these bait bags, and we'll start lining them up over at the pot launch,"
he said, gesturing to a pile of mesh sacks filled to the brim with ground fish.
"Gotta hurry if you want to keep the job."
I grabbed as many of the bait bags as I could and began to clumsily waddle toward the launcher at the side of the ship. The immersion suit was unbelievably bulky and made it difficult to bend my legs to walk. My feet slipped and shuffled as I tried to find purchase on the wet deck boards. I had just finished dropping the first load of bait bags when the boat grew silent. The engines had stopped. There was no more hurried noise from the crew, who had been readying the crab pots to launch. An electric sensation of fear jolted through my body in the sudden silence. I turned toward the deck to see all 7 deckhands surrounding me in a semicircle. Just as I was about to speak, I heard the door from the wheelhouse open and slam closed. Looking up, Captain Orange stood against the railing, hands clenched around the frigid metal, a grim look on his face.
"It ain't personal, Lucas,"
he shouted.
"We've got a tradition here on the Weeping Widow. Every 4 or 5 years, me and the boys sacrifice a man to the sea. Keeps the rest of us safe. Superstitious? Maybe. But we ain't lost a man accidentally in 22 years. That suit'll give you a few hours to get right with whatever god you pray to."
At first, I thought it was a joke, but a few of the men pulled work knives from their belts as they all walked toward me. Captain Orange had already turned and walked back into the wheelhouse, slamming the door behind him. The engines roared to life and the boat jolted forward.
"Over the side,"
Jimmy said.
"or the boys will have to stab you a few times to inspire you."
Please!
I screamed at the men as they slowly closed in on me.
Don't do this! Just take me back. I won't tell anyone.
They remained silent and continued forward. The first man was in arm's reach and leaned in to grab me. I swung my fist as hard as I could and made contact with the side of his head. He stumbled back, shocked at the unexpected blow. As I prepared myself to throw another blow, the others began to move in faster. While I was distracted by the first man, the others seized the opportunity to tackle me to the railing of the ship. I thrashed violently and hit every man within reach, but it was no good. I felt two of them wrap their arms around my ankles and lift me into the air. My hands clenched around the metal railing and they tipped me over the side. Grip still in place, I slammed against the hull of the ship and looked up in horror. 7 crazed faces stared down at me, smiling with sadistic glee. One of the men began trying to pry my fingers from the rails, but the sudden surge of adrenaline had increased my strength. No matter how hard he pulled my fingers or slammed his fist down, my grip wouldn't break. Then I saw one of the men vanish. He'd returned moments later with a hammer. Lifting the hammer above his head, he brought it down on my left hand with a sickening crack. White blurs of pain filled my eyes as I heard this sickening crunch. My left hand spasmed in pain and fell from the railing. The weight of my body strained my right arm as I continued to hold onto the rail. My muscles burned with agony as I watched him lift the hammer a second time. The second wave of pain swept my body as the hammer made contact. My vision went black. The splintered bones of my right hand gave way, and I fell to the churning sea below. My loss of consciousness was momentary. I felt as though I slammed against concrete as my body met with the rough waves below. The unimaginable cold encompassed my body almost instantly, and any hope of drifting away to a peaceful death vanished. I began to struggle against the waves and paddled my arms to turn myself upright. Fresh bolts of pain erupted in my hands and shot up my arms as I tried to use them to right myself in the water. The suit had kept me dry, but the bulk made it nearly impossible to control my movements. Finally, I managed to get myself onto my back and floated on top of the choppy sea. Whitecap waves lapped and slammed against me, filling my mouth with briny water and making it difficult to breathe. As soon as I passed over the top of a new wave, I would coast back down the back and dip below the water before coming back up and gasping for air. I could see the FV Weeping Widow rocking gently on the waves, and the spotlight moved into the distance. A man was standing at the back of the boat, one arm propped on the railing and the other waving merrily in my direction. It looked like he lowered it to blow me a kiss.
Thank you, Greenhorn,
He shouted with glee.
If my kids knew what you sacrificed to keep their old man safe, they'd thank you too. Please.
I shouted. I slipped under the water again.
Come back.
Another whitecap swelled over my head, filling my mouth with salty water.
Don't leave me.
A larger wave pushed me a few feet under, sending water into my lungs.
I can't. Please.
The lights vanished over the rolling waves, leaving me in the pitch dark. The water began to calm a bit as the wake of the boat settled. My balance returned, and I began to float calmly in the water. Stars burned brightly overhead. I had never been this far away from a city to see them so clearly. They would have been beautiful in any other setting. There in the Bering Sea, the stars would be the only witnesses to my funeral. I drifted for hours. The immersion suit had kept the worst of the cold at bay for a while, but I had eventually started to feel the icy daggers of the frigid water creep into my muscles. I had given up on trying to swim. My body ached, and it hurt to move. Hopelessness had overtaken me, and I simply waited to die. After letting go of the fear and anxiety, I noticed I felt a bit better. The water didn't seem to be as cold now. My body aches were dissipating. I felt almost comfortable. Hypothermia. Late stage, probably. It's no way to go. But by the time the false warmth starts filling your body, you're almost thankful. I had decided to close my eyes and rest and let the ocean take me, when I heard something in the distance. A rumbling sound. A ship's engine. I opened my eyes and scanned the area, and in the distance, I could see a dim light. There was a ship passing to my right. too far away to see me, too far away to hear me scream. I rested my hands on my chest as tears filled my eyes. My hands rested on top of a hard, found piece of plastic. Confused, I fumbled at it with my bent and broken fingers until I felt a bump on the side. Pushing it in, the night sky filled with obnoxious light. The damn suit had a strobe. I had been out here for hours and never checked the suit for any gear. There was no telling how many ships might have passed close enough to see it, but in my panic, I never checked. Bright flashes of light nearly blinded me as they radiated in the night sky. I shielded my eyes with my crippled hand and turned my head toward the boat passing me by. My mind was foggy, but I thought I could see a spotlight burst to life on the deck. A thin beam of harsh light began to scan the sea all around me. With great effort, I lifted my arms in the air to wave, hoping the reflective tape on the sides of the suit would catch their attention as well. After a few moments, the spotlight fell on me, and I had to shield my eyes completely. The light remained on me for what felt like an eternity, until I could hear the deafening roar of the engine of a ship nearby. Waves began to crash violently against me. Once again, I struggled to keep my head above water and breathe.
This is the United States Coast Guard.
A resonating voice called from the ship's loudspeaker.
We will dispatch a rescue team to pull you aboard.
A few moments later, I was pulled into an inflatable boat. There were a few men and women on board talking into radios as we sped back to the larger ship. The luminous spotlight followed us the entire way. It was like a light from heaven, carrying me back to safe harbors. I started sobbing uncontrollably. A woman sitting next to me grabbed my hand to comfort me. The pain was excruciating, but I didn't bother telling her about my injuries. I was too relieved to be in the sight of another person that the pain was worth the contact. I squeezed her hand back as best as I could with my shattered fingers. We pulled alongside the Coast Guard boat, and 4 cables dropped from a crane above. The rescue team started attaching the clasps to the boat, and in moments, we were lifted from the choppy sea. Tears flowed freely as we drifted upward to the deck. As we lifted above the side, the crane began to swing us onto the deck before gently lowering the boat. A swarm of warmly dressed men and women pulled me from the boat and put me on a stretcher. They chattered back and forth about care measures as my mind swam in the joy of my rescue.
Hey there, big guy, one of the men said. Can you tell me how you ended up in the drink out there? You're a long way from land.
Thrown overboard,
I said in a croaky voice.
crabbing boat, weeping widow, crew tossed me overboard.
The man's expression changed from professionally friendly to concerned.
Let me go grab the captain,
he said before vanishing through the rest of the crew. A few moments later, a woman stood beside the stretcher as the crew pulled me from my wetsuit and wrapped me in blankets. The serious woman held a warm cup of coffee to my lips, and I drank deeply. Sir, can you please tell me what happened on the FV Weeping Widow? I told her how the crew had cornered me before throwing me from the boat. She listened intently as I explained to her how I had treaded water for hours and how I had struggled to flag down their passing vessel. She nodded and assured me that I would be safe. Her version of safe differed greatly from mine. I was flown back to the mainland, and my hands were treated at a hospital in Anchorage. After my recovery, I was placed in an involuntary psychiatric hold for observation. The crew of the FV Weeping Widow all reported to authorities that I had become unstable after going out to sea. After running a string of crab pots, the captain had given the crew a few hours of rack time. While everyone was in their bunk, I must have snuck to the equipment room, put on the immersion suit, and jumped overboard in an elaborate suicide attempt. None of the crew faced charges, and the hospital eventually released me to fly home, broken and destitute. I'll never be the same. Yet the FV Weeping Widow still sails, as it always has. Every year they still lose one sailor to the sea. Only I know the truth. I leaned over the railing of the deck as our ship approached the infected coral. Even from at the height of the research vessel, I could see the blazing red algae cling to the reef like a parasitic blanket. The color was a mix of rust and blood. It stretched its limb lazily in the tide, consuming the marine ecosystem. Even the salt water smelled strange here. The ocean spray that drizzled on my cheek had an odor more like foul vinegar. We'd gotten several reports of wildlife acting strange in the area, most notably the dolphins in particular. Their usual playful nature had turned aggressive. People down the coast were being attacked by them like never before. A man had even caught video evidence of a pod slamming their bodies against the hull of a cruise ship like battering rams until their brains ruptured from the repeated impact. No one had seen anything like it. I wasn't sure of the exact science behind the terrifying change in behaviors, but I knew for sure it had something to do with the invasive algae. We were here to study it, to find its nature of origin, and most importantly, to eradicate it. "Hey Ben, that's an ugly son of a bitch, wouldn't you say?" Kyle, the master diver, called from the bow. "Oh yeah, she's ugly for sure. Looks angry," I replied. "Making everything else angry too, it seems. Reminds me of my ex-wife," he chuckled. "I don't know anything that could be as bad as Sheila," I laughed. "Isn't that the truth? Give me 5 and I'll be ready to collect your sample." Kyle scrambled to throw on his suit and diving gear as I checked over my notes. I was betting on the algae carrying some microorganisms that infected the brain, inflaming the amygdala. But I needed some samples to study back at the lab to be sure. "All right, preparing to dive. Captain, waiting on your approval, sir." Kyle sat on the edge of the railing, ready to submerge. I gazed up at the quartermaster. The broad shoulders of Captain Erickson engulfed the young lad from behind. He reached out a massive fist and gave the thumbs up. Kyle returned the gesture and situated his goggles, then flipped backwards over the railing and into the surf. The dive should have been textbook, 10 minutes in the deep and then out. Just enough to fit a few samples in a sandwich bag, carved out from his dive knife, then a quick ascension before spilling out onto the deck. But it had been half an hour, with no communication from his mouthpiece. The captain had even come down to the deck to pace the stern. He should be up by now, I thought, chipping an indentation on the clipboard with my thumbnail. Finally, there was a cry that crackled over the walkie relay system. We all sprinted to the port side, desperate to locate the diver. There was a blue expanse as far as I could see with a hint of red death, but no Kyle. I started to panic. What if he got tangled up? What if he's trapped on the reef? I was about to grab my own diving gear to follow in after him before the cook, Jeremy, shouted, "There he is! Right over there! Look!" We followed his finger pointing off to the right side of the reef. Yellow oxygen tanks bobbed over the surface of the water, but he wasn't moving. The captain signaled for man overboard operations, and the entire crew scrambled to recover the diver. The quartermaster reversed the vessel as we readied the nets and pulleys. Once we were close to Kyle, a crane extended over the deck and dropped the net into the dark waters. We shifted our course to the left and drug the net until the diver was scooped inside. The gears began to churn as he was lifted out of the water and dropped back onto the ship. He fell with a thud like a heap of mackerel on the trusses. The men quickly uncovered him from the netting and tore off his diving gear. He wasn't breathing. Pierre, the medic, started chest compressions. The entire crew fell silent as he pressed his palms on Kyle's chest in a rhythm before lowering his mouth to breathe into his lungs. I feared the worst after no reaction from Kyle after 4 minutes of this. Had he died from such a simple dive? It seemed so unbelievable. He was a Navy diver that had undergone wartime operations after all. Suddenly, he spat water from his mouth and was overcome with a coughing fit as he expelled the ocean from his lungs. We all circled around him, and as soon as he came to, we all broke out in a cheer. "What the hell happened?" Captain Erickson silenced the celebration. I don't know," Kyle replied, as confused as anyone else. "Try," Captain Erickson demanded.
I was swimming towards the reef when the algae seemed to, well, it seemed to swarm me. It was as if it were alive, a mind of its own. It wrapped around me and slammed me against the coral.
His eyes stared off into the sky as he explained. Impossible, I whispered.
Did you get the sample?
Erickson asked.
Yes, I got it.
He held out a baggie of water. A red hunk of algae swirled around inside the plastic barrier, as if it were trying to escape. Good. The captain snatched it from his hand and tossed it to me. I caught the bag and watched as it swam inside. Algae shouldn't behave this way. It's unlike anything I'd ever seen.
That enough for you to study, Doc?
His large beard twitched in agitation as his stern gaze met mine. Yes, sir. That should be plenty, I replied.
Good. Everybody back to business as usual. Let's get the hell out of here and back to the port.
The captain sauntered back to his quarters as we all took back to our positions and turned the research vessel around. It was a 4-hour trip back to St. Medina's Marine Research Laboratory, and the sun was beginning to set. I placed the sample in a secure chest until we reached the port. The crimson tendril swimming this way and that way was too unsettling. I didn't want to hold it any longer. I ripped open a bag of chips for a snack, just before a red strobing light spun in my cabin.
All hands on deck. All hands on deck.
A robotic voice repeated over the intercom. I rolled off my bunk and threw on a t-shirt before storming through the hull of the ship. It had only been an hour since the dive. What on earth was going on? As I ascended the stairs, I heard screaming. Shrill cries for help reverberated through the steel passageway. What in God's name? I murmured as I crested the deck. Jeremy, the cook, lay spread on the deck. He was eviscerated. His bowels gathered in a heap at his ankles as blood pooled in a pond around his skull. Bile rose in my throat as I fought the urge to vomit. I reached down to check his pulse with my fingers on his throat. Nothing. He was dead. I pushed the tears away from my face and rushed towards the quartermaster. I could hear cries for help from below in the living quarters as I ascended the steps to the helm. When I burst through the threshold, I saw 2 hands still gripping the wheel. They were torn from their roots. Stephen, the quartermaster, sat crumpled in the corner, his forearms a bloody ruin. His abdomen was hollowed out like a butchered calf. A cavern of meat and bone sat empty where organs and tissue used to remain. His eyes were rolled into the back of his head as if he were trying not to see what was happening to him. The whites bulged in their sockets as veins streaked across them. As I was just about to scurry back down the stairs, the captain rushed up them. He barreled through the passageway and slammed the hatch behind him, nearly knocking me from my feet.
Captain, what the hell is going on?
I cried.
Kyle, he's gone mad.
It was the first time I'd ever seen the captain show fear. He was normally so stoic, projecting strength and confidence. It was extremely unsettling to see him this way.
What do you mean he's gone mad?
I asked. He wrapped thick fingers around my chin and turned my face to look out the glass over the deck. Kyle, the master diver, was hunched over in the moonlight, tearing meat from bone from the poor cook. Blood spurted from the body as he tore into the corpse like a hyena.
Oh my God,
I whispered. I spun around and watched as the captain rifled through a drawer.
it has to be the algae. It must have invaded his brain, just like with the dolphins. What are we going to do?
For once in my life, I was at a loss with no plan of action.
We're going to kill him.
Captain Erickson pulled a large revolver from the desk and spun the cylinder before cocking back the hammer.
Okay, what can I do? You're the bait.
He grinned at me as my heart sank into my stomach. Kyle had left his meal of the cook splayed across the wooden boards and vanished somewhere below. The screaming had stopped, but I didn't think that was a good sign. I think that meant everyone was already dead and there was no one left to scream. I slapped the soles of my boots across the hardwood and began to whistle. It was the Marine Corps anthem that my grandfather had taught me as a child. I paced the bow, stomping wildly as patriotism escaped my lips as loudly as I could muster. I was almost done with the song before I heard Kyle scurry up the steel steps. He spilled out onto the deck and paused, staring at me hungrily. His eyes were bloodshot, and a red fungus had erupted through the pores of his skin. The algae had taken over and done the same thing to him that it was doing to the marine wildlife. Hey, buddy. You good? I asked, shakily. He just snarled and chomped his teeth together like a wild beast. The crowns of his molars snapped as he lowered himself to all fours and arched his back, preparing to bounce. Come on, Kyle. We're friends, remember? We both hate your ex-wife, I called out. But it was of no use. Kyle was gone. Only a monster remained, one consumed by the Red Death. He rolled back on his heels before leaping through the air like a jungle cat. I folded my arms over my head as he soared towards me. There was no way I'd be quick enough to evade the attack. Just as he was about to collide with me, 2 shots rang out from the other side of the deck. The bullet struck Kyle from the side, causing him to falter and fall to the deck with a loud smack. He screeched and began to drag himself across the ship's surface despite 2 large craters in his side. Captain Erickson strolled to his side and placed a large boot on his neck. Kyle chomped at his soul violently before the captain lowered the revolver to hover an inch above his forehead.
I'm so sorry, lad.
He whispered before pulling the trigger multiple times, turning the master diver's head into a canoe of mush. We both stood at the side of our old friend for a while. I was numb from what had happened, almost as if I were in shock and denial. Finally, the captain broke away to lean against the railing. He peered into the sky of stars for a long while before turning to face me.
You still have the sample?
He asked. Yes, I stuttered.
Good. Then these men won't die in vain.
He turned back to face the endless ocean. I didn't know why the algae had caused such violence, how it was even possible, but I promised myself, for the sake of Kyle and the rest of the crew, that I would find out, and when I did, I'd be back to destroy it. The Red Death would die. It would never do this again, not if I had anything to say about it. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and smash that like button to get notified every time I upload a new video. You can also check out some more of my animated horror stories right here.